It was 11:47 p.m. on a Tuesday when the Slack notification lit up my phone. Again, I was already in bed, already exhausted from the 12-hour day I'd just pulled, and already dreading what I knew was coming. Maya, need you to push that authentication fix to production tonight. Client demo at 8 a.m. No, please. No, thank you. Just Brad, my engineering manager, dropping another last-minute emergency into my lap, like he'd been doing for the past 2.5 years. I stared at the ceiling of my studio apartment in Austin, the one I could barely afford despite working 60-plus hours a week at Data Sync Solutions, and felt something crack inside my chest. I typed back, "The fix needs QA review first. It touches core security." 3 dots appeared, disappeared, appeared again. "We don't have time. I trust your work. Just push it." There it was. That carefully crafted sentence that made it sound like confidence in my abilities when really it meant, I don't want to be responsible if something breaks, so I'm making you do it without proper process. I pushed the fix. Of course I did. Because that's what I'd been doing since I started at this company fresh out of my computer science program, working my way up from junior developer to senior engineer by saying yes to every impossible deadline, every weekend deployment, every quick favor, that somehow became my entire responsibility. The demo went perfectly the next morning. I watched it from my desk through the glass walls of the conference room where Brad stood presenting to the client, a major healthcare provider looking to overhaul their patient data system. He gestured at the screen, walking them through the authentication flow I'd built from scratch, explaining the security features I'd researched and implemented over 3 months of late nights. "Our team really outdid themselves on this one," he said, and my stomach twisted. Our team. I was the team. Brad hadn't written a single line of code in 18 months. The other senior engineer, Marcus, had been pulled onto a different project. The 2 junior developers reported to Brad, but worked on completely separate features. The authentication system, the core of what was making the client nod appreciatively and talk about expanding the contract, was 100% my work. But Brad stood there in his pressed button-down and designer glasses, accepting their praise with a modest smile. "Well, that's what I'm here for," he said, "to guide the technical vision." I opened Slack, typed, "Glad the demo went well." Brad responded 30 seconds later, "Thanks for the late-night push. Couldn't have done it without the team." The team. Not you. Not Maya. The team. I closed my laptop and stared at the array of monitors on my desk, at the code editor still open from last night's emergency fix, at the half-empty coffee cup that had gone cold hours ago. Around me, the open office buzzed with the usual energy of a mid-sized tech company, developers with headphones on, product managers clustered around whiteboards, the ping-pong table in the break room getting enthusiastic use. I'd loved it here once. When I first started, fresh-faced and eager, thrilled to be working on real products that actual people used. Brad had seemed like a great mentor then, always ready with technical guidance, always pushing me to take on more challenging work. It took me almost a year to realize that challenging work meant work Brad didn't want to do himself, and that his guidance consisted of pointing me toward problems and then taking credit for my solutions. My phone buzzed. Text from my mom. "How's work, honey? Still loving it?" I'd stopped telling my parents the truth about 6 months ago. They were so proud that I'd made it in tech, that I was making $78,000 a year, decent for Austin, though not what male engineers with my experience were making, that I worked at a company they'd actually heard of. How could I explain that I was burning out? That I lay awake at night with anxiety about missing something, about letting the team down, about Brad's reputation suffering because of my mistakes. Mistakes that were really his lack of planning and his refusal to allocate resources properly? "It's great," I texted back, really busy with a new project. That afternoon, I got called into a meeting with Brad and Sarah Chen, our VP of Engineering. My heart rate spiked immediately. Unscheduled meetings with Brad and Sarah never meant anything good. "Maya," Sarah said warmly as I sat down in the small conference room, "we wanted to talk to you about the upcoming launch." The launch. DataSync's biggest product release in 3 years, a complete overhaul of our platform that we'd been building toward for the past 9 months. It was scheduled for 6 weeks from now, right before the holidays, time to coincide with when our biggest clients would be finalizing their budgets for the next year. "I've been working on the core infrastructure," I said carefully. "The API gateway, the new authentication layer, the data migration scripts." "Right," Brad cut in. Your contributions have been solid. What we're discussing now is the leadership structure for the launch. Something cold settled in my stomach. We're promoting Tom Hendricks to lead engineer for the launch, Sarah continued. Tom, who'd been hired 6 months ago, who was perfectly competent but had spent most of his time here working on minor features and attending architecture meetings. I'm not following, I said slowly. I've been the primary engineer on this project since day one. I built the entire back-end infrastructure. I wrote the migration strategy. I've been in every planning meeting. And you've done excellent work, Brad said in that patronizing tone I'd learned to hate. That's exactly why we need you focused on execution. Tom has more experience with enterprise launches. He worked at Oracle for 2 years out of college, I interrupted. 5 years ago. He brings a perspective we need, Brad continued as if I hadn't spoken. You're going to be crucial for the technical implementation, but Tom will handle client-facing communications, coordinate with product, work with Sarah and the C-suite on strategy. I looked at Sarah, waiting for her to correct this, to point out that I'd been doing all of those things already. She smiled encouragingly. This is a great opportunity for you to really hone your technical skills, Maya, and Tom's leadership will free you up to focus on what you do best, the code. What I do best. I'd led 5 major features to successful launch. I'd mentored 3 junior developers. I'd presented at 2 tech conferences on our architectural decisions. I'd been the on-call engineer who saved our production environment more times than I could count, including that memorable weekend when our database cluster went down and I spent 36 straight hours rebuilding it. But sure, what I do best is just shutting up and coding. When were you planning to tell me this? I asked, proud that my voice came out level. We're announcing it today, Brad said. Tom's going to send out an email introducing himself as launch lead. Today, I repeated. The launch I've been building for 9 months. You're announcing someone else as lead. Today. Maya, Sarah leaned forward, her expression concerned. I'm sensing some resistance here. This isn't a demotion. Your title isn't changing. Your compensation isn't changing. We're simply bringing in someone with Tom's experience to take credit for my work, I said flatly. The room went silent. Brad's jaw tightened. Sarah's professional smile faltered. That's not what this is, Brad said, his voice dropping into what I called his manager mode, calm, controlled, slightly condescending. And frankly, Maya, this attitude is concerning. We're making a business decision based on what's best for the company and the launch. If you can't be a team player here— I've been a team player for 2.5 years, I said, and something in my chest was expanding, pushing against my ribs, making it hard to breathe. I've worked weekends. I've worked holidays. I pushed a critical security fix to production at midnight last night because you needed it for a demo this morning. A demo where you stood in front of the client and said our team built something that I built. Alone. You're part of a team, Brad said. No one works in a vacuum here. You built on infrastructure that was already— I rewrote the entire authentication system from scratch. The old one was 8 years old and held together with duct tape. I researched modern security standards. I designed the new architecture. I wrote every line of code. I created the test suite. I wrote the documentation. Me, not our team. Me. Sarah cleared her throat. Maya, I think you're too close to this. Why don't you take the rest of the day, get some perspective, and we can— I'm not taking the day off, I said. I'm going back to my desk, and I'd like the meeting notes from today's discussion sent to me in writing. I stood up before they could respond and walked out. Back at my desk, my hands were shaking. I opened my laptop and immediately went to our internal wiki, to the project documentation I'd been meticulously maintaining. Page after page of technical decisions, architecture diagrams, code examples, implementation notes, all authored by me, all time-stamped. All there in the Git commit history showing exactly who'd done what. Then I opened Slack and scrolled back through 2 years of messages. Brad assigning me tasks at 10 p.m. Brad asking for quick fixes that took days. Brad telling clients we'll have that ready without asking me if it was even possible. Brad presenting my work in meetings I wasn't invited to. Brad taking credit in front of executives while I sat at my desk writing the code that made him look competent. I opened a private message to Jessica, one of the other senior engineers who'd left 6 months ago. Hey, I typed. Random question. When you left DataSync, you mentioned Brad taking credit for your work. Can you give me an example? She responded within minutes. Oh God, where do I start? The microservices migration? That was 100% me. He presented it at the company all hands like it was his strategy. Why? Just curious. Maya, she wrote, get out of there. I'm serious. I should have left a year before I did. My therapist literally prescribed anxiety medication because of that job. Now I'm at a startup, making 40% more, and I sleep through the night. Brad's a credit-stealing snake. Sarah knows and doesn't care because he makes her look good to the board. I stared at her message. 40% more. I was making $78,000. I'd asked for a raise 6 months ago and Brad had told me the budget was tight, maybe next quarter. Tom Hendricks probably started at $95,000. My phone buzzed. Email from Tom. Hi team. Excited to be stepping into the launch lead role. I stopped reading. Instead, I opened my personal email and started looking at my sent folder. Every tech recruiter who'd reached out in the past year. Every you open to opportunities? Message I'd politely declined because I kept thinking things would get better at DataSync, that Brad would finally recognize my work, that I'd finally get the promotion and respect I deserved. I was an idiot. But I wasn't going to be one anymore. I spent the next hour cataloging everything. Not just the launch project, but every major feature I'd built in 2.5 years. The API gateway, the authentication system, the data migration tools, the monitoring dashboard, the disaster recovery protocols, the performance optimization that had reduced our server costs by 30%. I downloaded every design doc I'd written, every technical spec, every piece of documentation. I exported my Git commit history. I took screenshots of Slack conversations. Then I opened a new document and started writing. Not documentation this time, a resignation letter. But not yet. I'd learned enough from Brad's corporate politics to know that timing was everything. The launch was in 6 weeks. Tom Hendricks might be lead engineer now, but he didn't know this codebase. He didn't know the architecture decisions I'd made and why. He didn't know about the 3 critical dependencies that needed careful handling, or the whole system would collapse. He didn't know that I'd built in fail-safes and backup systems that weren't in any documentation because I'd implemented them during late-night emergency fixes. I knew all of it, and I was the only one who did. That night, I started preparing. Not obviously, I still showed up to meetings, still answered questions, still pushed code. But I also started doing other things. I created a personal backup of all my technical documentation. On my personal computer, in my personal cloud storage. Every architecture decision, every system diagram, every piece of tribal knowledge that existed only in my head. I wrote it all down, but I wrote it for myself, in a way that would make sense to me and no one else. I started being very careful about what I committed to the repository. Nothing broken, nothing malicious, I'm not that person. But the comments that explained why things worked a certain way, those got a little less detailed. The documentation that would help someone else understand my code? That stayed in my personal notes. When Tom asked me questions about the system in our daily stand-ups, I answered them. Politely, professionally, but briefly. When he asked for documentation, I pointed him to the official docs, which were accurate but not comprehensive. They'd get someone 90% of the way there. The last 10%, the critical edge cases, the weird quirks, the things that would only matter under high load or specific failure conditions that stayed in my head. 2 weeks before the launch, I got a message from a recruiter I'd spoken with 3 months ago. Maya, I know you said you weren't looking, but I have a role I think would be perfect for you. Senior engineer at CloudCore, fully remote, working on distributed systems, $125,000 base, equity, unlimited PTO. The hiring manager specifically asked if I knew any strong engineers from DataSync. Interested in a chat? I looked at my calendar. Looked at the launch date circled in red. Yes, I typed back. Very interested. The interview process moved fast. They'd clearly done their homework on DataSync's tech stack and were impressed with what they'd heard about our platform architecture. What they didn't know was that they were really hearing about my architecture, my decisions, my work. I had 3 interviews over 1 week. Technical discussions where I actually got to talk about the interesting problems I'd solved, the trade-offs I'd considered, the systems I'd designed. No Brad interrupting to add context. No Tom trying to take credit. Just me and engineers who actually understood what I'd built. The offer came on a Wednesday morning. $125,000. Equity that actually vested over 4 years instead of DataSync's bizarre 5-year schedule. Remote work with quarterly team meetups in Seattle. And a title of Senior Engineer 2 with a clear path to Staff Engineer. I accepted immediately. Then I opened a calendar and counted days. The DataSync launch was in exactly 2 weeks. I needed to give 2 weeks' notice. I scheduled a meeting with Sarah and Brad for that afternoon. "I'm resigning," I said as soon as we sat down. "Effective 2 weeks from today." Brad's face went pale. Sarah actually dropped her pen. "Maya," Sarah said carefully, "this seems sudden. Is this about the launch lead situation? Because we can discuss—" "It's not sudden," I interrupted. "And no, we can't discuss it. I've accepted another position. My last day will be 2 days before the launch." "You can't do that," Brad said, and his voice had lost all pretense of managerial calm. "You're absolutely critical to this launch. You need to give us at least a month, 6 weeks, to transition. My employment contract says 2 weeks' notice. That's what I'm giving you." "This is incredibly unprofessional," Brad continued, his face reddening. "After everything this company has done for you, after all the opportunities we've given you, you're going to abandon the team right before our biggest launch?" "I'm not abandoning anyone," I said calmly. "I'm giving you 2 weeks to transition my work to Tom. He's the launch lead, after all. I'm sure his extensive enterprise experience will serve him well." Sarah pinched the bridge of her nose. "Maya, please. I understand you're upset, but can we talk about this rationally? What would it take for you to stay through the launch? A retention bonus? A title change? A raise? There's nothing you can offer me," I said, and I meant it. My decision is final. I spent the next 2 weeks in a strange state of calm. I showed up every day. I answered questions when asked directly. I even helped Tom with basic orientation to the codebase, walking him through the high-level architecture, the main components, the deployment process. What I didn't do was volunteer information. When Tom asked about the authentication flow, I showed him the code. When he asked about the migration scripts, I showed him the files, but I didn't explain the edge cases. I didn't point out the potential failure modes. I didn't mention that the load balancer had a quirk that required a specific configuration order, or that the cache invalidation strategy would break under certain conditions, or that there was a race condition in the session management that only appeared under high concurrency. All of that was documented. In my personal notes. On my personal computer. "Are you sure you've covered everything?" Sarah asked me in one of our daily transition meetings, which were really just sessions where she tried to convince me to stay. "I've walked Tom through all the major systems," I said truthfully. "The documentation is up to date. He has access to all the repositories. He can reach out if he has questions after I leave." What I didn't say was that the documentation was technically accurate but strategically incomplete, or that some of my most critical architectural decisions were explained only in commit messages from 2 a.m. on random Tuesdays, or that I'd built the entire system with certain assumptions about how different components would interact, assumptions that made perfect sense to me but might not be obvious to someone else. On my last day, I packed up my desk, turned in my laptop and badge, and walked out at exactly 5 p.m. "Good luck with the launch," I told Brad in the parking lot. He didn't respond, just stared at me with this mixture of anger and something that looked almost like fear. I drove home, opened a beer, and waited. The launch was scheduled for 10 a.m. on a Tuesday. Cloud Core had agreed to let me start the following Monday, giving me a few days off in between. I spent them hiking, reading, sleeping past 7 a.m. for the first time in years. Tuesday morning, I was on a trail in the hill country when my phone started buzzing. I'd turned off all notifications from DataSync, except my personal email, but apparently people had figured out how to find me. 12 missed calls, 23 text messages, 47 Slack messages to my personal account. I sat down on a rock overlooking the canyon and opened my email. From Brad, sent at 6:47 a.m. "Maya, we're having issues with the authentication system. It's not accepting client certificates properly. Need you to call as soon as possible." From Tom, 7:12 a.m. "Hey, the migration scripts are failing on the production dataset. Getting errors about constraint violations. Did you test these with real data?" From Sarah, 7:34 a.m. "Maya, I understand you're no longer with the company, but we're in a crisis situation here. We need your help. Please call me." From Brad, 8:03 a.m. This is unacceptable. You deliberately sabotaged this launch. We will be pursuing legal action. From Sarah, 8:47 a.m. Maya, Brad is understandably upset. Please disregard his last email. We're not accusing you of anything, but we desperately need your help. We can offer $10,000 as a consulting fee for today. More if we need additional days. Please. From Tom, 9:15 a.m. The load balancer keeps timing out. Did you configure this differently in production? The staging environment works fine, but production is completely broken. From Brad, 9:28 a.m. Clients are logging into the demo environment and it's not working. This is a disaster. You need to call me right now. I stared at the messages, feeling absolutely nothing. No guilt, no satisfaction. Just calm. I'd done nothing wrong. I hadn't sabotaged anything. I hadn't deleted code or broken systems or left time bombs in the codebase. Every single thing I'd built worked exactly as designed. The problem was that Brad and Tom had never bothered to understand how it worked. They'd relied on me to be there, to fix things, to explain things, to hold their hands through every complexity, and now I wasn't there. My phone rang. Sarah Chen. I let it go to voicemail. It rang again. Brad. Voicemail. Again. Unknown number. Voicemail. I opened my email and started composing a response. Not to Brad or Tom, to Sarah, because she'd at least been professional about it. Sarah, I wrote. I appreciate you reaching out, and I'm sorry to hear the launch is having difficulties. However, I'm no longer an employee of DataSync Solutions, and I'm not available for consulting work at this time. I would suggest reviewing the technical documentation and commit history for the authentication system, migration scripts, and load balancer configuration. Everything is documented, though it may require some time to fully understand. Best of luck, Maya. I hit send and turned my phone off. That night, I turned it back on to 43 more missed calls and an email from DataSync's lawyer. I forwarded it to my own lawyer. I'd gotten one the day after I resigned, just in case, and let them handle it. The next morning, my lawyer called. They're claiming you engaged in sabotage, he said. But from what you've told me and what I can see in your contract, you fulfilled all your obligations. You gave 2 weeks' notice. You didn't delete anything or break anything. The fact that they can't figure out your code isn't your problem. What did you tell them? I told them that if they continue to harass you, we'll file a complaint for workplace harassment and potentially a lawsuit for unpaid overtime. I saw you mentioned 60-hour weeks with no overtime compensation. They got very quiet after that. I laughed. Actually laughed, for the first time in months. So I'm clear? You're completely clear. But Maya, between you and me, that was some beautiful work. They completely relied on you and never appreciated you. You didn't burn the bridge. You revealed that there was no bridge there in the first place. Just you holding everything together. Over the next week, the story came out in pieces, through the tech industry gossip mill, and through Jessica, my former coworker who was still connected to people at DataSync. The launch had been a catastrophe. Not because anything was broken, the code worked fine. But Tom couldn't explain the architecture to clients. Brad couldn't answer technical questions. The authentication system, which I'd designed to be highly secure, was so secure that it rejected several client certificates that hadn't been properly configured, and no one knew how to whitelist them without compromising the security model. The migration scripts worked perfectly on the test data, but failed on production data because there were edge cases in the real dataset that I'd known about and handled in my testing, but which weren't documented anywhere except in my personal notes. The load balancer configuration was technically correct, but it had a specific startup sequence that needed to be followed, something I'd done automatically every time, but never written down because it seemed obvious to me. They postponed the launch by 2 weeks, then another 2 weeks. Then they brought in consultants at $400 an hour to figure out the systems I'd built. 3 weeks after my last day, I got an email from Sarah, not asking for help this time. An apology. Maya, it read. I owe you an apology. We failed you as a company and as leaders. You were absolutely right about everything you said in that meeting. We took your work for granted. We didn't recognize your contributions. And we made a serious error in judgment with the launch lead decision. I've had several long conversations with Brad, and we both understand that we lost an exceptional engineer because of our own failures. If you would ever consider coming back, we would like to offer you a position as staff engineer, with a 45% salary increase, reporting directly to me instead of Brad, and full leadership of the platform team. I understand if that's not something you're interested in, but I wanted you to know that we recognize what we lost. Best, Sarah. I read it twice, thought about it for maybe 30 seconds. Then I wrote back, Sarah, thank you for the apology. I appreciate you taking the time to reflect on what happened. However, I'm very happy in my new position at CloudCore. I'm working with a team that values my contributions, on problems that challenge me intellectually, and for compensation that reflects my actual worth in the market. I wish you and the team at DataSync the best of luck. Maya. I hit send and closed my laptop. It was a Thursday afternoon. I'd just finished a design review with my new team at CloudCore, where they'd actually listened to my technical concerns and incorporated my feedback, where my engineering manager had ended the meeting with, Great points, Maya. Thanks for pushing back on that. You're right that we need to think through the scaling implications before we commit. Thanks for pushing back. Not you're being difficult, not can you be a team player. Thanks for pushing back. I walked out onto my apartment balcony, coffee in hand, and looked out at the Austin skyline. I'd worked 60-hour weeks for years. I'd sacrificed sleep, health, relationships. I'd poured everything I had into building systems that made Brad look competent and made DataSync profitable. And the moment I stopped, the moment I was no longer there to prop everything up, it all fell apart. Not because I'd sabotaged anything, because I'd been the only thing holding it together all along. My phone buzzed. Message from Jessica. Have you heard? Brad got fired. Tom quit. They're hiring 3 senior engineers to replace you. 3. And Sarah apparently went to the board and told them they'd massively undervalued their engineering talent. I smiled and took a sip of coffee. Sometimes the best revenge isn't burning the bridge. It's walking away and letting everyone see that you were the bridge all along. And sometimes the best way to make them understand your value isn't to explain it. It's to let them try to function without you. I'm making $125,000 a year now. I work 40-hour weeks. I'm learning new technologies and solving interesting problems. I sleep through the night. My therapist says my anxiety levels have dropped dramatically. And every few weeks, I see another DataSync engineer update their LinkedIn status to open to opportunities. I hope they all find what I found. Companies that appreciate them, managers who respect them, and the understanding that your value isn't determined by how much of yourself you sacrifice. It's determined by what you build, what you know, and what happens when you're not there to do it anymore. The silence on my phone from DataSync these days, it's not awkward, it's not bitter, it's just quiet. And for the first time in years, the silence belongs to me.